discomfort to yourself. This is to love me. Then Baba called for the repentance prayer to be read by one of the men, and when it finished, he said that in his divine authority he forgave all our sins up to that moment. Now again, if I might interrupt, the sequence may have been different from what I have conveyed here. I don't think it matters. The important thing is the particular things that happened on that first afternoon, that first day, and particularly the afternoon after lunch. The atmosphere I will never forget while I'm in this body. I'll never forget how it was, and the incredible intensity of atmosphere when everyone was confronted with this issue. Are we going to be serious about loving God? Are we really going to be serious, which means obeying him? He has said, don't hurt the heart of another. He has said, love and serve, even at the cost of one's own discomfort, one's own suffering, and so forth. Yeah. Well, to continue, the hours that Baba spent with us in this meeting hall were the most consistently serious period of his entire visit. His love enveloped us, penetrating deep within our hearts and challenging us in the sincerity of our declared love for him. Far from here seemed the sunny, light hours of his stay 2 years earlier in Mayor House, Sydney. Far were those personal moments of human intimacy experienced by many in Sydney and Melbourne. Now was the confronting challenge of our next step towards the spiritual path. Did we step forward with him, or did we linger to wait another day? As he said during those hours, as Jesus I said, leave all and follow me. And now I say, hold fast to my Dharman. I've been saying the same thing in different words down the ages. Be honest with yourself in your love for me. Love and obey me. But if you cannot love and obey me, then just obey me. And my Dharman cannot fall from your grasp. And that's the most important aspect. That's what Baba has, of course, as we've read, Baba has said that obedience is greater than love. It's easy to feel for Baba, there's no question, but it's not easy to obey as he wants us to obey. That was certainly conveyed to us all, to my mind, at that time and that day. The culminating point of that most intense time appeared to be when a teenage boy, deeply troubled over the question of absolute obedience to Baba, again had tears in his eyes. Baba gestured to him with the most loving expression. Baba loves you. You must not be sad. As tears still fell, Baba added, when you cry, see, Baba also cries. As he pointed to the rain that was gently falling. In that moment, surely beloved Baba was expressing the compassion for all in Australia and our difficulty with absolute obedience to his wishes. Yeah, there's no question. It was a most beautiful moment, and yet at the same time incredibly moving, intense. The impact for me anyway was so marked. Again, it's a scene that in this life I'll not forget. Yeah. Now, during the other days, of course, there were lighter moments. There was no question. There was the time after that. We met again the next morning, but it was definitely, the meeting place was not a suitable area to meet. Only partially built as it was at the time, and Baba gestured that we should be, the next meeting should be in Baba's house, and so to talk about a light moment, there was that moment when I was sweeping the floor prior to putting down the timber stumps and empty kerosene drums that the planks of wood were placed on. They were our seats in those times with Baba. I was sweeping the floor prior to doing that, and I just happened to glance up, and there was Baba sitting in his chair just outside the doors of his room, and he blew me a kiss. Again, there was lighter moments when he stood with a group of us looking towards the ocean just below the window of his room, and pinching Francis's ear and saying how well he had chosen for his centre here, for the place of pilgrimage.
And what about the time early in the morning of the second day when you were trying to pile the dirt up?
Yes, yeah. That's right. Another moment, another time, which stays so clearly in my mind, was I got up early in the morning of the 4th of June, and conscious of the draftiness of the meeting place, of the meeting hall, 4 meetings there, I went with a shovel and endeavoured to pile the earth. The Hessian had came down, but there was a gap of 3 or 4 inches between the level of the earth and the bottom edge of the Hessian burlap, and so I started to build up soil to minimise the gap, and as I was doing so, I was again so conscious that Baba was there in his house, so close, and in thinking of being aware of it, being so much aware of it, I paused for a moment, and like a true Australian workman, leant on my shovel looking towards Barbara's house, thinking of Barbara. And at that point, so incredibly, the door opened and Erich appeared and saw me and said, "Bill, Francis wants you and Francis. Barbara wants you and Francis to come. Wants you, just simple, you and Francis." So I immediately downed the shovel, ran down to the farmhouse, got Francis, and we came, and that was one of those wonderfully intimate, so natural meetings with Barbara, where we came in to his room, gestured toward, bowed to him, and he gestured for us to sit. The Mundley stood, and yet he gestured for Francis and I to sit. And so I sit now in that same place, in the other angle of the room, looking towards Barbara, seated in his chair in the corner. And that was one of those times, as I've said, so natural, so intimate, where Barbara gestured. Now, I don't remember the whole. We were probably there half an hour. It was a good period of time. And I don't remember it all. The main thing is that it was with regard to the development of the property, that it was to be a place of it was to be developed as a place of pilgrimage. It was to be developed as the main centre for Australia. That we were instructed to form a trust, and that there were to be 5 trustees. And he said that Francis and I were to be 2 of those 5, and then asked who would we suggest as the other 3. And we named 3, Robert Rouse, Reg Paffel, and John Bruford. And Barbara acknowledged. At one point, he spoke about me being Francis's right hand, and also gestured that Robert Rouse would be Francis' left hand. Now that an aspect of that was that in the interview that I had with Barbara, that was myself and the family, where the 5 of us were with Barbara.
When was that?
This was on the Wednesday morning. Yes, the 4th.
That same morning?
That same morning.
But later?
Later. He directed that we were to return to Sydney, to Mayor House, and that I was to continue my work of spreading his message. That same meeting that I was describing, with Barbara, Francis and myself with Barbara, he brought up the question of where the children were, and directed that the children who were the young ones, younger than 9 years of age, were to be brought and be with him for the remainder of the time. And as it happened, it was Michael's birthday, so my son Michael's birthday. So he was delighted. And it may have been in the afternoon. You could say Michael got his special little present, birthday present, that Barbara, that we were all seated in his house. You know, by this time we'd moved from the meeting hall into his house, and Barbara said that he would distribute his prasad to us in the form of a sweet, but that we were to catch it, that he would throw it to each one of us, and that we were to catch it, and until we caught it, it had to be continued to be thrown. In Michael's case, even though, what was he at that time? He was 7 years of age, and he'd already proved to be a good catcher, a good cricket catcher of the cricket ball, but he kept missing the sweet that Barbara would throw to him, and in the end he came up to Barbara and Barbara placed it directly in his hands. Yeah, and that was another light moment. That I was seated on one side of the house, of the big room there, the big open space, not his room, but the open space where we were gathered. I was on one side and Francis was right on the other side. So there was, perhaps you could say, 20 feet between myself and Barbara, and between Barbara and Francis. And again, 20 feet between myself and Francis. Nice sort of triangle. And Barbara gestured, looking towards Francis with a sweet. And I thought, oh, he's going to throw it to Francis. Yeah, fine. And I was looking towards that. And the next thing I knew, the sweet had landed in my hands, which were open in my lap as it happened. I looked down and there it was. I didn't even see it coming.
No, you can put the book down.
Yes, thank you.
You wanted to read some more?
No, that's all right.
Show how your hands were.
What?
How were your hands to get this?
Yes, that's right. Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, this is how I was seated, as I sort of normally are. And all of a sudden, there it was, Barbara's sweet. How delightful. Okay, J. Barber. J. Barber. Well, to continue.
We were talking about the afternoon of the 4th, Mike's birthday, with the sweets.
Yes, yes. But I wanted to say generally, let me think of special occasions. There were special occasions. For example, when the men were all called in, the male Barber lovers were called in to be with Barber in his room, and Barber distributed a gift to each of a stone from Seclusion Hill. The biggest one was given to Francis for Avatar's abode. The next size was given to me for Maya House. And then, as far as I remember, a small one was given to each man. But the one incident that I remember very clearly was one one man coming to Baba to receive his gift, his prasad, and extended his left hand, and Baba gestured, "No, extend your right." That stands out. Otherwise, what I have to be honest, I was extremely inarticulate myself in those days. I was not able to contribute to the outwardly that expressed my joyousness of being with Baba, as the Americans were, as I mentioned earlier, in reading of the accounts of Baba being, for example, in Myrtle Beach in '58. What a wonderful time it seemed. And yet it was, there was no question that there was the same emphatic, down-to-earth statements about love for God that Baba made then as he did here. But I couldn't help but feel a certain lack of depth of feeling for Baba. Now, I have to also, there's no question, I have to include myself in that. As I said, who knows, maybe others were feeling as deeply as I felt. But at the same time, there was a certain element of a certain degree of indifference that I felt. And looking at the time, during that period, during those 4 days that Baba was with us here on the abode, and in thinking about it, I tend to say that we were a young people in Baba's love, and perhaps I could say too that we are still a young people. And it is interesting in the light of that when one reads that Baba said, "America will lead the world spiritually." And there is no doubt that in visiting America now, there is a much greater degree of intensity of love for Baba in general in America than there is here. But at the same time, that does not make any difference to there is no question that Baba did not come to Australia twice just in order to visit us. We will mature, and of course the maturity will come from suffering and reflection on our part of how to love and serve him better and better, to a greater and greater extent. Okay, towards the end of the 4 days, I've forgotten now. I can't remember the actual the actual occasion, but Barbara directed that 4 of us, that is Francis, myself, Robert Rouse and John Bruford, were to come back with him to Sydney, were to travel back with him. And that was that. So flights were accordingly booked for us to be with Barbara on the return flight from Brisbane Airport to Sydney Airport. Barbara, again, I have a sense that Barbara decided to leave Avatar's abode fairly early, which was around the 1 p.m. mark, if I remember, on Friday the 6th of June. And I can remember what stands out in my mind, and that incident. I should also mention an earlier incident, yes, concerning my father. My father and mother were present during the meeting. This stands out in my mind. During the meeting in Barbara's house on Thursday afternoon. And Barbara called, we were all seated, and Barbara called for my father to approach him. He was the only one that Barbara asked to do so, and my father came to Barbara, and Barbara embraced him very strongly and warmly. I say that in the sense that all I know is that it was a prolonged embrace, and it appeared in every respect to be a strong, warm one. The other occasion was Barbara seated himself at the edge of the veranda. I think that I did mention where Barbara was seated on that last day, Friday, just before departing, and he was seated on one of the wooden kitchen chairs that we had provided for the men Mundley to eat, to use, with their table. And Barbara, again, everyone filed in front of Barbara and kissed his hand, and then gathered on the other side of the driveway that that I mentioned earlier. Yes, and they were all standing, and Barbara was seated there, and Barbara's son again gestured for my father to come to him, and again my father came, and this time knelt down and was embraced by Barbara. it was a very touching occasion for me.
You've never seen your father do that before?
I'd never seen my father go down on his knees to anyone. And it's a scene that has stayed very clearly in my mind. So then Barbara then got into the car, and the two cars, that is Barbara's car driven by John Bruford, and the car that I was driving, we then circled under the veranda and out, and that circular road that I detailed, with the Barber lovers on the side waving farewell. It is true that many of them didn't see Barbara again.
Did your parents stay on the abode when he was there?
No, they were staying in a motel towards Maroochydore.
And Joan and the kids were in the farmhouse?
Joan was with the women in the and Michael would have been with me, and the girls would have been with Joan.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I don't remember those details very clearly.
That's okay. Just get on with your story.
Yeah. So we set off again for Brisbane, and we got to Brisbane again. Barbara departed into the cottage, and the only thing that I remember, two things that I remember of that evening. One was that I drove Artie Senior into the shopping area of Brisbane in order to buy certain things for Barbara. And I can't remember whether I was told, whether he mentioned, I don't know. But I remember driving him, and then driving him in, driving him out. I don't remember the amazing how whole scenes disappear in one's mind. No recollection. What shops we went to? No, nothing. The other thing that I remember was the evening meal, and Artie talking to us about being with Barbara, stories from his life with Barbara. But the only thing that I remember, again, unfortunately, in one sense, is Artie's declaration, die before death. In other words, die in love for Barbara before one physically dies. And I can still remember us sitting round a large circular table having dinner, and Artie saying that.
Was that in the Bellevue Hotel?
In the Bellevue Hotel, yeah. Yeah.
Barbara would have been with Erich in the...
That's right. I know nothing of the arrangements where the food was delivered to them. The men Munderley would have arranged all that themselves. Okay, in the morning I got up early in order to prepare or help prepare Barbara's breakfast, which was cooking his prunes. What else? Again, I'm sorry that I can't remember clearly, but I do remember. I remember that, and as I began gradually the men Mundley appeared, and the other in the kitchen of the hotel, and the thing that one little outstanding measure was that the night porter joined us and was so amazed that 7 or 8 of us, no, it would have been 7 of us, were grouped around the cooking a single breakfast. And he said, "Must be a most important man." And I said, "Yes, the highest of the high," which he didn't respond to. And why would he? And no doubt had no idea what I was talking about. Did anything mystify him? Yeah, so there was that. Then again we set off early in the morning. My experience has been, with the little travel that I've done with Baba, my experience has been that he's always arrived very early. Perhaps because he liked being, he would work with the crowds that would be around the airport. The movement, the coming and going of people. That could be it. Anyway, we arrived early, but there was that as far as the Brisbane airport, the terminal building, it was deserted then. And I remember just coming in no formalities, or little formalities, and Baba seated himself down near the tarmac end of the hangar, and we stood around. Baba gestured for me to go and get the morning paper, which I did. I can't remember where I got it. It may have been available at the airport. But I do know I got it, I brought it, and Baba gestured for me to read to him. And I looked at it, and I saw nothing that could be of interest in my mind to God. It was very much a local country paper. There seemed to be no international, no national or international news, nothing but local items. And I hesitated, wondering what would be of interest to him. And Baba just took the paper from me so naturally, just grabbed it, took it, and handed it to Erich. And Erich then read the headlines of each of the items. And I think that Baba did gesture 1 or 2 for him to read a little of it. But that's all I remember. I don't think it was continued for long. The next thing I remember was being on the plane and Baba passing the packet of cornflakes that we were given for breakfast on the plane to me. And me thinking, wondering, because I had been in a little agony of doubt. Did I put sugar? Did I sweeten the prunes sufficiently for Baba? Did I put any, or was there enough? And I couldn't remember. And I wondered when he passed me the packet with a smile, the packet of cornflakes, that perhaps it was his gesture of forgiveness to me. If I had that I had forgotten to sweeten the prunes. That's what I remember. We arrived in Sydney, and I can remember being with Barbara, the group of us being there, and as though Barbara himself thought, what will we do now? For myself, I was totally unaware of when Barbara's plane left for India, of any arrangements that may or may not have been made for his arrival in Sydney. I was just with Barbara. Barbara said, "Come, be with me," and I was with him. And then it was, my sense of it was that Barbara thought and then said, "Let us go to Mayer House," as though he had just thought of it. Now, Mayer House was, of course, the Beacon Hill house that I've spoken about earlier. And so the 9 of us were able to get into 2 taxis. And I was in, well, I've forgotten which one I was in. All I know is that we that we duly arrived at Mayer House, and the taxis pulled up on the road short of the driveway that then approached closer to the house. And I leapt out thinking that I would naturally open the house for Barbara to be there. But then as I approached, I leapt out not thinking, just all I thought of opening the house. I leapt out, and as I approached, I suddenly realised, but I haven't got a key. And of course, that slowed me down. I thought, what am I going to do? And in the process of slowing down, I became aware that Barbara had also come and was walking alongside me. And approaching slowly, me thinking, what am I going to do? What's the answer to this? Barbara had by this time come to the rather large stone entrance, the step leading into the house. And when I think about it, it just seems so amazing that there was God standing before a closed door, and I didn't have the key. Anyway, I thought, Barbara, maybe one of the windows is open, and I'm sure Barbara nodded. And that's the sense that from my memory of that scene and me being there alongside Barbara, perplexed, what will I do?
With no Erich.
There was no Erich there. We were alone. There was only the 2 of us there. And that was so for some little time. So I tried the kitchen windows, which the 4 kitchen windows were alongside the front door, and the windows were about that long, about